Us now, California Congressman Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, thanks very much. We wanted to get all of the legal and investigative issues out there. Is there anything more you can share that you know of this investigation and your assessment of whether this was handled correctly?
Well, it really leaps out to me, and first of all, hats off to law enforcement for the incredible with which they arrested this guy. What leaps out at me is really the amazing similarities between this case and the Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bombing. Here you have someone, the child of refugee or asylum seekers, who appears very assimilated, who becomes radicalized, who had foreign travel, very much a subject of our interest in Afghanistan, Pakistan, who also built a bomb very much along the lines of what you find in Inspire magazine, who placed some of those bombs along the route of a race, just as in the Boston case. So the similarities are quite dramatic, and as Richard Engel was pointing out, we're looking through all of the media that was seized. We're looking through all the foreign travel. We're doing a complete dissection of as much as we can find out about him. The most pressing question, of course, is did he act alone? And I don't think we know the answer to that yet. Obviously, in the Tsarnaev case, this was not a single person acting alone, and that's probably the most pressing inquiry. We haven't seen any intelligence that would indicate that there was overseas direction of this plot, but of course we don't know what happened during his foreign travel. And with encrypted communications, we may not even know if there were communications from overseas. But there's no evidence of that yet. There's also no evidence that there is a foreign-based cell operating. But that's a separate question, again, from whether he had accomplices.
What about the components and the explosion, the materials that he used? Some very sophisticated, we're told. At the same time, the fingerprint and other things indicate someone who is not very well versed in bomb making.
Well, and I think we see this a lot. We see elements of sophistication in many attacks, and then elements that look very amateurish. And in terms of where some of these devices were planted, that didn't make much sense if you're trying to inflict maximum casualties, although the one that was along the race could have been quite devastating. At the same time, the way they were packed with materials to maximize the carnage and some of the other aspects of the devices were sophisticated. The fact that if he was acting alone, he could do so many of these devices undiscovered also shows some sophistication. But I think we're going to learn a lot more about how he was able to conceal this, or in fact, if he concealed it, or whether others were aware of what he was doing.
And Congressman, Donald Trump's response in his speech last night. First of all, in an earlier interview, he talked about we should be profiling, law enforcement should be profiling. I've talked to counterterror experts who point out the legal and also strategic reasons not to do that. But at the same time, he was lamenting that he gets a lawyer, that he's hospitalized with room service. If you could respond to Donald Trump's characterizations of this in the last 24 hours.
Well, it's hard to know where to begin to critique his response just within the last week on a whole host of events. But in terms of this terrorist attack, to say that he should be deprived of medical treatment, this is sort of akin to his idea that we should, bomb and kill even the families of terrorists. The way that he views not just all refugees, but really all immigrants is essentially through the prism of the threat they all pose to the United States. Immigrants are either murderers or rapists. Refugees are all potential terrorists. That is the way he views the world, and he would basically follow the narrative of a clash of civilizations. It's us against the Muslim world, which is a terrible narrative at complete odds with our morals, as well as tremendously counterproductive. And I'll add one other thing, Andrea, that really leapt out at me earlier in the week, and that is when we had this mistaken bombing by the United States of Syrian troops. You heard what the Russians said. We did this deliberately because we're secretly behind ISIS. Well, they got a big help from Donald Trump by saying that we, the president and Secretary Clinton, founded ISIS. So when he says these things, it has real-world consequences. It plays into the narrative of our enemies like ISIS, but also plays into the narrative of the Russians.
And any reaction to Donald Trump Jr. Tweeting out with the official logo of the campaign, so he wasn't just copying an earlier tweet from a former Congress member. But tweeting out that this is like Skittles, comparing Syrian refugees, many of whom are children, to Skittles, the candy.
Well, you have to say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and this is a pretty rotten apple to say something like this, that essentially children who are fleeing war and violence are like poison candy. I'm not sure what to make of it, except it's just another in a string of incendiary statements coming out of the Trump candidate and the Trump campaign, and one I think we should all repudiate.
Adam Schiff.